Hello and welcome to TA Talks. I'm Srinath, your host, and today I have with me Keith Tudor and Graeme Summers. Gentlemen, please introduce yourselves.
Hello, I'm Graeme Summers, speaking to you from my office in England. And thank you to Surya on behalf of SAATA for inviting us, myself and Keith, to share with you some of our thoughts about co-creative TA. I will hopefully be speaking to a number of you who I met last year in Coimbatore and Bangalore. It was great to be part of your multi-level learning event. What a fabulous learning community. And thank you for making myself and Sue Eusden so welcome last year. It was a fabulous experience. We're still relishing it. So I'll really welcome this opportunity to reconnect with some of you and answer some questions posed to us about co-creative TA.
Thank you, Graeme. I have fond memories of the workshop you and Sue Eusden did on co-creative TA in Coimbatore last year. And on behalf of SAATA, I'm really thrilled to reconnect with you and get your thoughts on some of the questions we have on this subject. But before we move to those, let's say hello to Keith.
Kia ora, good health. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. My name's Keith Tudor, and I'm delighted to be speaking with you through the SAATA newsletter journal website. I'll very briefly say that I am a professor of psychotherapy here at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand, and I'm also currently the head of the School of Public Health and Psychosocial Studies, which includes psychotherapy but also a number of other disciplines and research institutes. I've been involved in transactional analysis for about 30 years, and I'm still passionate about it and still writing about it, and indeed writing is one of my passions.
Thank you, Keith, and welcome to TA Talks. It's a pleasure to be able to connect with you through this medium. So without much further ado, let's get on with the questions then. Graeme, over to you.
So how is co-creative TA similar to and different from classical TA? There are huge overlaps in terms of similarities. We will use the same diagrams, the same terms, parent, adult, child, transactions, games, scripts. We really share Byrne's desire to create and develop a theory that is both accessible and sophisticated, that helps us understand what goes on within us and between us. The differences are really probably two main emphases. One is we wanted to talk more about health. We thought in traditional TA there was perhaps an overemphasis on pathology, and this is particularly true in relation to games and scripts. So we wanted to articulate a version of TA that could speak equally as well to health as it can do to what goes wrong. Secondly, the main emphasis is that shift in emphasis is that we wanted to talk more about relationship and more about co-creation, or as we think about it, ongoing mutual influence. So to create a theory which supports us in the ongoing inquiry in terms of what's happening between us and what are we doing together to either create the same old patterns, or to create something new, something different, something that supports our developmental direction.
Okay, so in essence, co-creative TA lays more emphasis on developmental health over pathology, and also on what is going on between us instead of what's going on within each of us. So yeah, that's interesting. Perhaps can you make this a little more concrete for us, Graeme?
So I'd like to give an example of how I use this approach. A coaching client says to me, I'm looking at the feedback I get from my direct reports, and they say I'm not there much, and when I am, I'm critical. I say, what do you think about that? He says, it's true, that's my leadership style, that's how I lead. What I see is his defense of that stance, and I see his pride in that stance. I notice an impulse to be critical of him in that moment. I hold back on that impulse. Instead, I teach a short teach on ego states, and I talk about parent and child being defenses and adult being a more resourceful and resilient way of building relationships and getting things done more effectively. After that teach, he says to me, what I'm aware of is that this idea of not being there much and being critical, that's how my father would relate to me. And as he said that, he was clearly expressing hurt and vulnerability. And I was alongside him in that experience. And after a little while, he was then open to really revising this stance, his leadership style as he saw it, and really then open to how else he might relate, what else he might try as a way of leading people that might be more effective.
Interesting example, Graeme. So by becoming aware of the process between the two of you, you and your client were able to co-create possibilities for change in his leadership style. You mentioned the adult ego state. That gives me a nice segue to the next question, which is on the integrating adult, and how is it similar or different from the adult ego state as described by Byrne. Keith, can you throw some light on this question, please?
In some ways, maybe it's not a trick question, but maybe it's a trick answer, in the sense that I'd say the integrating adult isn't different from how Byrne defined the adult. The issue is that Byrne defined the adult in two rather different ways. One is the more familiar data processing, computer-like adult, and the other is his definition of adult in structural terms, which is that part of the psyche, or which he referred to as the neo-psyche, which is feels, behaves and thinks in ways that are appropriate to the here and now. So in a sense, in his book, Transactional Analysis and Psychotherapy, he set two definitions running. And the integrating adult is our way of clarifying that second tradition. That's obviously a very short answer to a rather complicated question. I have answered it elsewhere in two publications, one on the neo-psyche, which was published in 2003 and reproduced in our latest book, which was 2014, and the other is a TAJ article on the state of the ego in 2010. So I recommend you to those readings.
Thank you for that trick answer, Keith, and also for the reading recommendations. So what motivated you guys to come up with these concepts of co-creative transactional analysis and the integrating adult? Keith, what problems were you trying to solve?
And probably for the longer answer, I'd recommend you to read particularly our two introductions to the co-creative book, because I think we have some motivations in common, Graeme and I, and some slightly different. But essentially, we were wanting to acknowledge a more vibrant, lively view of transactional analysis that was informed by contemporary discussions about constructivism and deconstructivism, about developmental psychology, and from health psychology, so that following people like Finita English and Bill Cornell, that we don't see scripts as inevitably pathological, but we see them as self-defining, but not always self-limiting. And we essentially took that logic all the way through our critique of transactional analysis. So I'd say the co-creative transactional analysis is a rereading of TA rather than a particular school of TA.
Okay, so co-creative TA is really a rereading of transactional analysis from a developmental perspective, and not really a different school of TA. It's an important clarification, Keith. Thank you for that. So that brings me to the question of whether everything is co-created, right? So do you believe everything is co-created, and are there critiques to such a belief or view, and how do you respond to those? Graeme, do you want to take that?
So, is every experience that we have co-created? I don't know. What I do know is that I find it a useful perspective to hold, and certainly a useful perspective that gives me an alternative to everything being my responsibility. I'm responsible for my experience. I create it. I have, experiences. I make script beliefs. I make script decisions. I act in ways that are self-limiting, or I make script redecisions and I do something different. All of that seems to be very focused on me. And I really like this idea of just taking another angle on it and saying, well, so what of, how is who I am a function of who we are? Or what is it about, what's influencing me right now? What's helping to shape who I am, who I can be? How might I be influencing someone else, for better or worse? What contribution might I be making to someone else's sense of self, to their experience? I think it's a nice question, because I think it invites an inquiry into a social perspective, not just an individual perspective, and that's where I think it has value. I think it can be misused, and it certainly can be misused if I might suggest that someone who's a victim of abuse or violence or some form of social discrimination could say, well, they're co-creating that, that's their fault. If they did something different, it wouldn't happen to them, a way of blaming the victim. Keith and I address some of these questions in our book, especially when we look at power dynamics and look at are we using power with people, or are we using power over people? So I think they are some of the ethical caveats that any idea can be used or abused, and I think that's something that we need to take account of when we think about this idea of co-creation. I think what we're offering is a lens. We're just offering. We're saying, hey, look at what happens between people. Look at how we shape each other. Let's be curious about that. We're social beings. We influence each other in all sorts of ways. Let's be curious about that and be interested in that as an ongoing process. And for me, that's a useful counterbalance to an overemphasis on the individual.
Fair enough. Of course, any theory could be used or misused. And it's great that you have mentioned about the ethical aspects and power dynamics concerning co-creative TA in your book. It's a significant aspect for any theory. That brings us to the final question, which is centered around the applicability of co-creative TA across multiple cultures. Is it applicable or is it specific to a single culture? What are your thoughts on that?
This is something that I feel particularly strongly about as somebody who has worked cross-culturally for a number of years, and as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm now here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is a multi-ethnic society and a bicultural nation, and that biculturalism acknowledges the tangata whenua, or the first people of this land, who are Māori, and hence my use of Māori greetings and so on. When I arrived here, I came across a book called Southern Theory, in which the author, Raewyn Connell, talks about where the ground is different, the form of theorizing is different too. So I think, for me, the co-creative approach encourages people to think creatively about theory. And so to question current theory, TA theory. For instance, whether the concept of the cultural parent is the best way to think about the cultural transmission of messages between generations, or whether we might consider that and conceptualize that as also part of the integrating adult. So on that perhaps controversial or stimulating note, I'll leave you. Many thanks again for inviting me. Ka kite anō, till we meet again.
Thank you very much, Keith and Graeme, for your stimulating and controversial answers. I thoroughly enjoyed hosting both of you on behalf of SAATA. With that, we come to an end of this session of TA Talks, where we had Keith Tudor and Graeme Summers speak about co-creative transactional analysis and in the integrating adult. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Bye.